Today we have a professor here, Kari Baumgartner. She joins us from the College of Humanities, and she works at the Department of Languages and Culture. So you know what we're about to receive. We will talk about Germany. Kari, you're from Switzerland, correct?
I am, yes, I am from Switzerland, but my subject is Germany. It's 19th century Germany and early 19th century Germany, the Romantic period.
Great. This goes a little bit home. For those who don't know me, I'm Christoph Dressler. I'm directing Go Learn at the University of Utah, which is the faculty-led travel program. So what we do is a faculty member helps us creating a trip around a theme that he or she studies. And then we are trying to get people from the community and as far from East and West Coast, all alumni if you want, because we also are the travel provider for the Alumni Association. Big shout out to our partners at the Alumni Association. And we are taking the classroom on the road. And Karin is guiding our German trip to Fairyland Tale. And why this is so special for me is I grew up in the woods, literally in Germany. And so creating this trip for us here, for our community, it was just something really special and made me really, really, really homesick. And now, since we can't travel, I want to thank Karin to join us today and to actually bring her subject matter to us, bring the road to your living room. So thank you for joining us. We're about 170 people, so let's get started. Thank you so much. For those who don't know, we are recording this so you can send it to your friends later on. Find out more about Go Learn at golearn.utah.edu and see our speaker series there if you want. There will be questions and answers after this. So if you are wanting to send a comment in or a question, there's a Q&A on the bottom and a chat on this. So you can send us that, and I will leave the room and give the floor to Karin, but then I will join again and we'll get to these questions at the end of this, which will be about in an hour from now. All right, Karin, are you ready to take it?
I am absolutely ready to take it. And thank you, Christoph, for inviting me to speak to all of you. Like many of the professors who you have met this summer, I feel a bit lonely at home without my students and without the outreach we usually do. And I'm just absolutely delighted to be able to speak to you. I'm not able to see all of you, which is a little bit weird in Zoom because we usually can see each other. But I'm looking forward to seeing your questions. And as Christoph says, use the Q&A button. And if there is something that's unclear in my talk, please ask, and I'd be so happy to answer that. So the title of my talk is Germany, Memories of Tales Past, Present, and Future. And really what I'm going to talk about are the Grimm fairy tales. And I'm going to intertwine it with the trip that I took last year with some guests to go to Germany. So we are not talking about all of Germany. We are actually talking about a very small area in Germany. It's called Hesse, where the Grimms were born, where they went to school, and where they worked. We are going to talk about Hanau, Steinach an der Straße, Hannoverisch Münden, Kassel, and Marburg. They are all in Hesse. And then we are going to talk about two other places, Heidelberg and the Rhine River. So these are side stops. And the time period I'm going to concentrate on is the early 19th century when the Grimm tales were collected. So my first point is going to be Heidelberg. We start our trip in Heidelberg because the romantic movement that engendered the fairy tales began in Heidelberg. And here on the left, you can see a picture of my group with the bridge monkey in Heidelberg. So on the right picture, you can see the bridge. I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but the bridge is here in the foreground, and there is a tower. And when you entered Heidelberg, you could enter it over this old bridge. The old bridge is actually a replica of an even older bridge. And the bridge monkey is here. And the bridge monkey looks at the city of Heidelberg and shows its backside, aka its butt, toward Mainz, where the bishop of Mainz is located. And the people of Heidelberg, or of the Palatine, were basically thumbing their nose at the bishop of Mainz, who is Catholic, of course. Heidelberg is Protestant. And were sort of telling him that, you know, he could stick his nose, you know, where. The monkey also has a mirror in his hand, and that mirror symbolizes self-criticism, self-evaluation. You were supposed to look in the mirror and think about your own flaws. The monkey also makes the sign of the horn. It's unfortunately hidden here. And if you touch the horns, you are said to come back to Heidelberg. So that's really fun. So let's talk about the picture on the right with the castle up here on the mountain. So this is one of the really, really famous pictures of Germany, of Heidelberg. This castle, I have another picture here. At night, it is lit up. It's really, really beautiful. Now, this castle is a ruin today, and it has been a ruin for a very, very long time. It was built during the Renaissance period, but it was half destroyed in 1537 when a lightning bolt hit the upper castle. They tried to fix it. They started rebuilding it. It was expanded by 1650, and then it was destroyed in 1688 during the war, the French Palatine War, when the French king invaded the Palatine region. They started to fix it again, but in 1764, another lightning bolt destroyed it. And by that time, they gave up. The elector moved to Mannheim and later to Munich. And the castle was left to sort of just sit there and decay. A lot of the Heidelberg people started, you know, carting off the brick and started to strip the interior of, you know, metals, those things. And yeah, it sat there until the late 18th century when it was rediscovered by British tourists. And one of them is, I always have to look up all the initials, J.M.W. Turner, a British artist, you will recognize him, who stayed in Heidelberg several times. He drew the castle several times, he painted it several times, and contributed to its popularity. I have another image. This is from a German artist, Karl Philipp Fohr, who painted it in 1815. So what I want you to take from this is that Heidelberg was already a tourist destination in the early 1800s. It was viewed as a representation of the German spirit. And we are going to talk about this now, why this is so important. So Heidelberg is a representation of the German spirit, and it's a tourist destination in the end of the 18th century, early 19th century. So now we're going to talk about the fateful year of 1806. Until then, Germany had been organized in this agglomeration of kingdoms, duchies, city-state, ecclesiastical states. You see there is a very colorful carpet of different organizational structures. All of this held together under the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. Um, in 1806, Napoleon abolished this. Now you might ask, so why does Napoleon abolish the German nation, this Holy Roman Empire? How could he do that? Well, what happened was, remember, in 1789, the French started to revolt against their king and queen, and they deposed the king and the queen and later beheaded them. So Marie Antoinette, the famous Marie Antoinette from Let 'Em Eat Cakes, she was actually the daughter of Maria Theresia of Austria-Hungary and the sister of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Francis II. So Austria and Prussia went to war with the French, which they promptly lost. They went to war several times. And by 1806, both Austria and Prussia had been subdued by Napoleon. Napoleon immediately incorporated everything that was left of the Rhine River, and the Rhine River is here. All of this became French. The south of Germany, Württemberg, Baden, and Bavaria were incorporated, they became vassal states. So they were not French, but they were French allies. Hanover up here belonged to the Brits. So there really was no more structure left. And Napoleon therefore made Emperor Francis II abdicate. And the Germans were left wondering, well, who are we? Are we French now? If we are German, what are we if we are not the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation anymore? So this was the big question in 1806. Now enter two young artists who lived in Heidelberg, or one of them lived in Heidelberg at that time. We have here on the left side, Achim von Arnim and his best friend, Clemens Brentano. Brentano lived in Heidelberg in 1806, or even before that. And both of these young men were active in the movement to figure out what German identity constituted now that the empire was gone. So they had the idea that in order to figure out what the German spirit is, what the German nation truly is, we have to go back in history and we have to look at German writing. You might know that most writing was done in Latin before the 18th century. So what they figured out is that if you go back and you look at folk songs, you can get at the German spirit. And that's exactly what they did. They began collecting German folk songs and they published it in this incredibly popular book called Des Knaben Wunderhorn, the youth magic horn, old German songs. They had gone to libraries to collect these songs. So as they were doing this work, the first edition came out in 1806, they started thinking that it might be good if they would do a volume of old German folk tales. Both of them were really, really busy with their own project, and they needed help, and they were wondering, oh, who could we employ to go out and collect those folk songs? So, like today, they relied on their personal connections, and Clemens Brentano, again, he is the one here on the right side, had a friend and brother-in-law, Karl Friedrich von Savigny, who was married to his sister, Gunda Kunigunde Brentano. He was a law professor at the University of Marburg, and he was a rising star. He was a professor of law, and he had written a blockbuster, The Law of Possession. I mean, if we can talk about blockbuster books in jurisprudence. But he argued that Germans shouldn't use Roman law to adjudicate their cases. He argued that the legal system needs to be based on the culture of a people. It needs to grow organically with the people. And so he said Germans should go back to Salic law, to their own German legal system. So he was really in line with Brentano's thinking that you had to go back to German history to find out what the German spirit really was, what it needed and what it deserved. And he, Savigny, was the mentor to two precocious young students, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm. And I put their birth years here. Jacob was born in 1785 and his brother Wilhelm in 1786. They were studying law with him, and they already had a reputation as being interested in old German stories. They had already started collecting folk tales. And Savigny made the introduction to Brentano. And before we go on with the history of the Grimm's fairy tale, let me show you a picture of Marburg. It's actually quite beautiful. It wasn't destroyed in the Second World War, so we still have the half-timbered houses here. It is built on a mount, on a hill, and so all the streets are either up or down. It's, as I said, it's very, very intact. Here is the house where the Grimm brothers lived, and you might think, oh wow, that's pretty cool, it looks pretty posh, but the Grimms lived up here under the roof in one unheated room as when they were students in Marburg. So Savigny made the introduction, and they met Brentano, and Brentano introduced his project to them. So let's talk a little bit about the two Grimm brothers. Here I labeled them. This is the older one, Jacob, and this is Wilhelm here on the left side. They were born in Hanau, which at that time was the capital of Hesse-Darmstadt, where they lived. They grew up in Steinau an der Straße. They were orphaned quite early. They went to school in Kassel and then in Marburg. And as I already told you, they were, as students, quite famous for their interest in philology, for their interest in old German texts. Let's go on. I told you they grew up in Steinau an der Straße. Their father was a lawyer in the service of the Margrave of Hesse. And he was sent to Steinau an der Straße to administer the toll road. And as you can see here, Steinau an der Straße, this is the Straße, the street after which it's named, which is a very important east-west route for trade. And their father was the magistrate there. He was in charge of assessing goods that went east-west, west-east, and extracting tolls of that. Steinau itself is this beautiful village, also intact. It was not destroyed in the Second World War. And you can see it's exactly what we imagine a fairy tale town to be. There is a castle here. The church is in the center. It looks as if it has a wall around its little city. There is water here. The fields are outside. So the Grimm brothers grew up in this small, intimate, very picturesque place. Here is the house in which they grew up. We have the bottom was the contour, the office of their father with all his scribes and his clerks who helped him, and the family lived on top here. And today it is a really delightful museum. It has lots of artifacts from the Grimm family. You can walk through it. It is furnished. You can see the kitchen and their living room, their parlor. Here's just a picture of some of my guests on a grandfather sofa here with, I think this is Jacob and Wilhelm next to them. And outside in the market square, we have a fountain dedicated to the Grimms. You probably recognize this tale. This is the Frog Prince. And back here we have the story of the fisherman and his wife. And on the other side, we have the story, of course, of Little Red Riding Hood. Here is the wolf eating the grandmother. So let's go on. I wanted to give you another map just so you can get your geography straight here. So here is Hanau, close to Frankfurt. This is part of Hesse. There is Steinau an der Straße, where they grew up. There is Kassel, where they went to high school. And then this is Marburg, where they studied. And then they returned back to Kassel. So the Grimm brothers experienced tragedy when their father died in 1796. Jacob was 11, Wilhelm only 10. Their younger sister Lotte was only 3 years old. And this left the family destitute. The mother had to move out of their grand house. She had to move into a small cottage, because of course there is no social security, no health insurance, no provision for widows. The Grimms had 5 children, so the brothers that we know, 2 more boys and then a girl. And the Landgrave of Hesse didn't come through with a pension for the widow. And it fell to Katharina Grimms, the mother's sister, so the aunt of the boys, to help out. She was a lady of the chamber to the Landgravin of Hesse, and she supported the family. When the boys were old enough to go to high school, she brought them to Kassel, where they could finish high school, and later she supported them in 1802 to go to Marburg, to the university. She paid for them to attend school because they already had a reputation as being particularly precocious and particularly intelligent. They were already known around Hesse as these prodigies. So this is the geography and a little bit of the biography of the Grimms. Now I'm going to talk about the time period of 1806 to 1810, when the Grimms were actually engaged in collecting tales. 1806, as I said, they were approached to collect the tales. Jacob was actually in Paris. He was going to Paris with his mentor Savigny, and he served as his secretary there, whereas Wilhelm stayed back in Hesse and he started collect the tales. In 1806, after Jacob had returned, he became the superintendent of the private library of Jerome Bonaparte, who had now been installed as the king of this area. And since Jacob had finished his studies, he got this job, and now he could start supporting his family. So he fetched his mother from Steinau to Kassel and took up a house, and the Grimm brothers began a what you could call a bourgeois existence in Kassel, all the while collecting tales. So this image is done by their brother, Ludwig Emil Grimm, usually known as Emil Grimm. And it is sort of the myth of the Grimm brothers as it has come down to us. What we see here is one of their informants, Dorothea Viemann, here in the center, telling the brothers stories. What you see here is a rural environment. We have chickens in here. We have a young woman in what we would call a rural dress, a tracht. And we see children around the brothers listening to the tales. What is really interesting here, it's a domestic environment. So it's the interior of this house. What we don't see in this image is our men. So what the image tells us is how the Grimms penetrated the domestic sphere where women were located and extracted those tales from the old maid here, Dorothea Viemann. However, this is actually a myth. It's not true, because let's remember the Grimm brothers in 1806 are young. They are 20 and 21 years old. So what do young men like to do? They like to hang with young women, right? And that's exactly what they did. So Kassel has a number of Huguenot families, and the Hassenpflugs were part of the Huguenot community in Kassel. Huguenots, for those of you who don't remember, are Protestant French people who had to leave France after the Edict of Nantes. So after the massacre of St. Bartholomew's in 1572, they fled to Germany. A number of them went to Berlin, but a large number of them went to Hesse, to Kassel. And a lot of the German monarchs welcomed those Protestants because they were clockmakers. They were very, very accomplished and skilled artisans. So they wanted these people to come and settle in their area. So this is Marie Hassenpflug. She and two sisters and a brother were the same age as the Grimm brothers. And Marie was a very gifted storyteller. She is the one who told the Grimm brothers about a lot of the tales that we think of as Grimm tales: Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, right? However, remember I said they spoke French at home. They are French speaking. So a lot of these tales are actually French tales from Perrault that Marie had heard in her childhood from her French-speaking nanny and passed on to the Grimms now. By the way, Marie's brother married the Grimm's sister. So again, everybody is connected. Another Huguenot family were the Wilds. And here we have Dorothea Wild, who also was a very gifted storyteller. She later became Wilhelm Grimm's wife in 1825. And she also passed on a lot of the fairy tales that we associate with the Grimms, like the Frog Prince or Mother Hulda, to the Grimm brothers here. I have another slide. So you see there are a lot of tales that came to the Grimms through Marie and Dorotchen. I had mentioned Dorothea Viemann on that one image. You saw her. The Grimms actually didn't meet her until 1813, when they already had published one volume of their fairy tales. So her tales are included in the second volume, and 40 out of the 70 tales in that volume come from Dorothea Viemann. And Dorothea Viemann too, she is of Huguenot descent. And even though she looks like a peasant woman, she is Huguenot, so she would have been French speaking at home. She was, she married a little bit beneath her. She married a tailor, even though she was the daughter of a restaurateur, of somebody who held a post station. But again, she would have read and heard about the French fairy tales at home. And here again, some of the tales she told the Grimm brothers. Here is an image of the place where Dorothea Viemann lived. I said that her father held a post station, so it's a coach station where people would change horses when they traveled either east-west or north-south. And this place is called Knallhütte. So the verb knallen means to make a noise, especially the noise of a whip that goes through the air. So that refers, of course, to the coachmen who would, sort of swish their whips through the air. Here on the right, you see her with one of her tales. That's the fisherman and his wife. You see the fish here. And when we were there last year, the Knallhütte, which is now a brewery, was open. The interior was really lovingly restored to a 19th century setting. It served excellent beer and excellent food. We really had a wonderful time there. Unfortunately, the Knallhütte did not survive the Corona recession and had to recently close. We don't know how long, whether this is forever or just until Corona is under control. So quite sad that, because it was a really magical place. But back to the Grimm brothers and their story. So by 1810, they had finished their manuscript. They had collected stories, and they sent their manuscript to Brentano. In the meantime, since 1806, Brentano had lost his beloved wife and then married again in a disastrous marriage and gotten divorced. So he had left Heidelberg, and he was itinerant at this time. He also had moved on with his interests, so he was working on his own poetry and his own writing, and he was no longer interested in the folk tales. The Grimms contacted Brentano's friend, Achim von Arnim, and Achim, who knew Brentano, said, you guys need to publish this yourself, and he made the connection with his own publisher and the Grimms, who fortunately, this is really fortunate for history, had kept a copy of the finished manuscript. So they didn't just have one copy and send it to Brentano. They had kept the copy. They reworked their copy, and in 1812, they published the first edition of the folk tales with 86 stories. As I have said before, in 1813, they met Dorothea Viemann, and she provided 40 more tales. They collected some 30 other tales and included 70 tales in their second edition. In 1819, they revised their 2 volumes. They put it in one volume, and they revised it significantly. And then over the next, where are we now, 30, 40 years, they did 5 more editions. With the last edition in 1857, with 211 stories, editions or the reworking of the tales stopped because Wilhelm Grimm died at that time. Jacob had moved on to do other stuffs, and Wilhelm was really the keeper of the fairy tales. So here we see an image of the brothers' own copy of the first edition. And you can see in the marginalia, in the writing here in the margins, how they are editing this first edition. How they made structural changes, they made narrative changes, they took tales out, they put other tales in, and they really reworked the style of the tales. And all this happened while they were in Kassel. So Kassel has a museum entirely dedicated to the Grimms. It's called Grimmworld, aptly named. And here you can see the Grimms books, you can see notes, you can see letters, and their personal possessions. Here on the left image, you see the 1815 edition of the tales. Here we see Dorothea Viemann in an etching done by Emil Grimm, and here again the Kinder- und Hausmärchen on the right side. The image on the left shows you the Grimm's notebook, and you can see how they revised the tales. Here in the marginalia, you can see additions, you can see commentary that they made on the tales. Here is the Cinderella fairy tale in really neat writing. I'm just always so touched when I see writing or when I see a document in the hand of the artist, and I'm really struck by how neat their handwriting is. It's of course the old German script, which is very difficult to read for us these days. But as I said, I just find it incredibly touching to see a material object that connects us with these artists. Here I have some more images of their notes and personal correspondences. The Grimmworld is not only dedicated to the fairy tales, but also to the dictionary. Jacob Grimm dedicated his life to writing a German dictionary. Remember, they were really interested in finding the German spirit. So part of it is to really record the German language. And so the Grimmworld is also dedicated to that. And then it always has an exhibition of a modern artist there too. This is Ai Weiwei, who is interpreting the Grimms. And I just thought this was wonderful. These objects here, they look like tree trunks, so they are very fairy tale-like, right? With their arms extending, so it invokes the fairy tales. At the same time, Ai Weiwei is referring wood pulp, and paper is made of wood pulp. So he is both referring to the imaginary quality of the Grimm fairy tales, and of course of their material conditions, that they have only survived and been so successful because they were written down in books, and of course that is based on wood pulp. So just a wonderful exhibit. So in the Grimmworld, if you ever get a chance to go there, you can see the wing dedicated to the fairy tales, a wing dedicated to the brothers' work on the German dictionary, and then a modern artist who interprets the legacy of the Grimms. Okay, so what is the Grimm Brothers' secret of success? They are not the first ones to do fairy tales. Many other people had written fairy tales. We have an Italian tradition. We have a very successful French tradition. We have an 18th century German tradition in fairy tales. But today we know very little about it. I think before we answer this question, we probably need to answer another question first, like what is a fairy tale? And why are there no fairies in most of the fairy tales, right? And usually I let my students work this out, but I'm going to give you the answer. The definition of a fairy tale, or a German Märchen, is that it is stories about human beings. It's not stories about gods or demigods or angels. So it is set among humans. It is a story where the magic has to be taken seriously. So if you do not believe or entertain the notion that gold can be spun into, that straw can be spun into gold, the fairy tale won't work for you. So you really have to believe the magic. It has always closure. It always has a happy end. So it is a very, very optimistic genre. It has a protagonist who is often the youngest, the smallest, the stupidest, but who ends up managing the crisis. So it tells you, even if you are somebody who is not valued, you can still triumph in the end. It is very formulaic, so it tells us that the world can be managed in this way. It always has the repetition of 3, which tells us we have to try, and we will triumph at the end. And this is very important. It was not specifically written for children when the Grimms began collecting the tales. Okay. So, what is their secret of success? Part of it is narrative and stylistic. So they got tales that didn't look at all the way we understand the tales now. They had different beginnings and different ends. And during the 7th edition, the Grimms rigorously standardized the tales. In the end, they all, or most of them, began with Once Upon a Time, obviously the German version of it, and they ended with Happily Ever After. If they haven't died yet, they are still alive. They streamlined the narratives, so now we have one plot per tale. Older fairy tales, especially the French fairy tales, were very meandering. Some of the fairy tales are 120 pages long in their written form. So the Brothers Grimms wanted to strip the tales of all that embellishment and stick with the plot. Part of it was that their imagination of the German spirit was the Germans were simple people, so they would have simple tales. They did not have elaborate tales like the French. They simplified the language on the one hand, but also made it more lively. So what they did is they took out a lot of the subclauses in the German language that weighs down a sentence, so it can be read faster, and then they added a lot of dialogue to their texts, and they introduced Christian morals as they went through the 7 editions. Here is a sample of what it looks like. This is from The Frog Prince, and this is the negotiation between the princess and the frog about getting the ball back. And you can see the 1812, the first edition of the tale is very, very short. It's real to the point how what the frog wants. On the right side, you have the 1857 version, where you have a lot more dialogue that makes this very, very lively as you read this. And I can pull it up later if people don't get a chance to finish reading it. The Grimms were very good at listening to their readers. I think they were some of the first writers who really took their readers into account. After the first and the second edition, the 1812 and the 1815 edition, they received many, many letters of people either offering tales to them or telling them how they liked them or didn't like them. And they received letters from parents who asked the Grimms to remove sexual content from the tales because they were reading the tales to their children, and maybe more importantly, they were reading the tales to their servants. And so they obviously were very concerned for the sexual morals of their servants. And here is another example of the subtle changes they made as it comes to sexual content. Again, we have 1812 on the left side, 1857, last edition on the right side. And this is the moment when the king orders the princess to honor her promise to the frog and go to bed with him. So in the 1812 edition, it's a very overt reference to sexual intercourse. He was supposed to lie next to her. That's 19th century speak for having sex. And we can see here the passage begins with the princess was horrified. She was afraid of the cold frog and did not even dare to touch him. And yet he was supposed to lie next to her in her bed. She began to cry and didn't want to at all. So we really see the princesses resistant to this forced rape. On the right side, we see that the Grimm brothers removed the horror that the princess feels. She's just crying now and she's afraid of the cold frog and still doesn't dare to touch him, but yet we do no longer have a reference to lie next to her. It has been replaced now with sleep in her beautiful clean bed. So basically she doesn't want the slimy frog in her clean bed, but the reference to sex has been removed in this passage. The feedback, of course. The Grimms were also very attuned to their readers who asked the Grimms to remove violence from the tales. In the 1812 edition, and only in the 1812 edition, we have a tale that's called How Some Children Played at Slaughtering. And this is a tale of children watching a butcher a pig, and then they emulated and use a younger sibling as the pig and kill the child. So obviously that is not a fairy tale parents want to read to their children, and taking that feedback, the Grimms excluded a tale, and it's only included in the very, very first edition. So again, why are the Grimm tales so successful? I think that the Grimms were really helped with sort of the retarded development in Germany in the 19th century. So I'm sure you know that France and Great Britain had the Industrial Revolution very early in the late 18th century for Britain, early 19th century for France. But that didn't happen in Germany really until the 1870s. So Germany was a rural country with small towns, and here you see Hannoverisch Münden with its half-timbered houses. So we have a lot of well-to-do Brits and some French people coming and traveling in Germany to see this country that had produced these fairy tales. And the tourists would come, see these areas, and that of course would feed into the success of the fairy tale. Also, Germany has an abundance of castles. Here is one, and here's another one. This actually is the castle that is said to be Sleeping Beauty's castle. You can see the roses around the tower there. It used to be a hotel. Right now it's empty. They don't really know what to do with it. Germany has other fairy tale sites. This is a sort of swampy area with a spring where Mother Hulda is supposed to come up to earth from her realm under the ground. And then of course we have towers like this one that is said to be Rapunzel's tower. So as you can see, Germany has all these locations that resonate with people who have read the Grimm's fairy tale. This fed back into Germany and their desire to build castles. So now this castle, the Löwenburg in Kassel, looks very, very old. However, it is a replica of an old medieval castle built at the end of the 18th century, in the early 19th century, so the time period we are talking about. And it is built as a ruin. The interior was quite swanky for the time, very, very modern. And it was the Landgrave of Hesse's weekend house. So this was his palace where he would meet his mistress on the weekend, and then he had a palace where he would live during the week, and from where he would rule Hesse. But so you see how Germany as a location fed into the fairy tales, and then the fairy tales fed back into the locations. So Germans too started to think of their own land as a fairy tale. And I think that really contributed to the success of the tales. So here are my last few slides. We did do a Rhine cruise because the British tourists came down the Rhine River, and very often did this portion from Koblenz to Rüdesheim, which is said to be the most beautiful part of the Rhine River. We did it on an old paddle boat from the 19th century, or from the beginning of the 20th century, I think. And again, more castles and more castles. As I said, Germany has an abundance of castles. Here is the Lorelei mountain where the Lorelei, the sorceress, is supposed to sit. The Lorelei is a poem by Heinrich Heine, and of course, more importantly, here are the vineyards in the back. And here is a picture of the Mäuseturm, which was actually a toll tower on the Rhine River, where the Germans taxed all the traffic on the Rhine River. And here is the city of Bacharach. And you see the vineyards in the back here. Bacharach takes its name from Bacchus, the god of wine, of course. And I'm going to leave you with these pictures of our group in Germany with lots of German food. We really indulged in wonderful German food. Here on the right, you see a beer menu with some advice how to use beer to cure your ailments like diabetes, high blood pressure, all kinds of illnesses. Here is Rüdesheim with a wine cellar, and you can see the decorations on the facade of the house. You can taste wine, you can buy wine, of course. Here's more German food, and here is our last evening in the Klosterkeller in Frankfurt before we had to leave. So now I would be happy to answer some questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I guess, Christoph, are you coming back in?
I'm right here.
All right.
Thank you so much, Karin. How cool was that? Awesome. We'll get to some of the questions. It was so fascinating, even for me as a German, just to go back and learn once again, you know, what does Napoleon have to do with fairy tales? well, we Germans didn't know who we are or something like that. And I'm just, the whole German mind and psyche has a lot to do with that time period and even beyond, and has a lot to do with fairy tales and so many lessons, as you know, have influenced us German and have influenced the thinkers following in the Romantic era.
Right. Yes, that's, I mean, really true. Without the French, there would be no German national spirit. There would be no fairy tales. And I mean, in two ways. I mean, the Grimms absorbed a lot of the Perrault, of the French fairy tales. And of course, the Brentano and Achim von Arnim were influenced by their resistance to Napoleon. So without Napoleon's, no fairy tales. So yay, French people.
Right. Which, I noted it down, the Huguenots, immigrants from France.
Oh yeah, that's right, the Huguenots too. Yeah.
Altering the course of history in many ways. You mentioned Berlin here. In the 17th century, Berlin was 20% French. So, and of course, great knowledge came with the immigrants. And Berlin was this little village, little swampy village, and it turned into the powerhouse that we know today, but also the intellectual powerhouse thanks to all those immigrants. So, mentioning immigrants here, let's get to some of the questions. Let's start with the questions and answers here. You mentioned, this was one of the first ones come in right after we started. You mentioned that Hanover originally, before Napoleon, belonged to someone, but I missed the name. Please repeat that. Thanks.
Yes. So Hanover belonged to the British. Or actually, we have to do it the other way. Britain belonged to Hanover.
Yep.
Right? So through inheritance law, after the British, the Stuart line died out, they went searching for a new ruler. And through a female line, Britain fell to Hanover, and the King of Hanover became George the. Now somebody should Google this. I don't know which George it is. The second?
I think so.
Third.
Second or third?
Yeah, it's the third. That is the one who lost America, right? So it was either his father or grandfather. Well, George the First, right, became the first George in Great Britain. Yes. So Hanover was what's called in personal union with Great Britain. So the king of Great Britain was also the king of Hanover. Yeah.
Yes. And it was Queen Victoria who lost that title because obviously she was a queen, or not obviously, but just to remind people how this works, once you get a hubby as a queen, the next offspring gets the name of the hubby. So the husband was Albert, of Saxon, Coburg Saxon, and Gotha. Gotha. And so that was the royal name until, the Germans pissed them off in World War I, and they changed it to Windsor. So, but that's all side.
Victoria could not be queen of Hanover because German Salic law does not allow for women to rule. So Salic law goes through the paternal line only. So that is the reason. Sadly,
she kind of lost a little bit, but she obviously, as we all know, Queen Victoria did great things in her life, and thanks to her, I think the monarchy took a good turn over there, at least during the Industrial Revolution. So that was one question. A good one here from Mark is, have you read many of the fairy tales collected by others that did not become part of the Grimm Brothers collection? How do they compare to those that were selected by the Grimm Brothers?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. And I actually do have several hours in my course that I teach dedicated to this. Yes. So we are so lucky in that we have Brentano's copy of the manuscript. Brentano was at that time in the Alsace in a monastery. And when he left the monastery, he left the manuscript behind, and it got found in the 20th century, I think. the Grimm brothers had burned their own manuscript after the book came out. That was the custom, that you burned your manuscript at that time. And it allows us to compare the original plot summaries and the original tales with what then was published. So the manuscript really was just plot summaries. They had written it down exactly the young women had told him. And then, and it wasn't very stylistically developed. And then in the first edition, we see how much more elegant it is. We have fairy tale collections from the same time period. We had one found, sorry, I had set myself a timer. We have found one not too long ago, about 15 years ago in Bavaria. And I usually give my students the same type of tales to compare. And we again can see how much the Grimm brothers structured their tales. So when we read them, they seem natural to us. But when you read the same tale in other writers' telling, you see how brilliant the Grimms were. So really, other writers are much more meandering. So one plot would sort of drift into another plot, and 3-4 tales would be smooshed together, and they had really taken all the plots apart. Also, their writing is just so clear and so lively, and so the narration that isn't dialogue is really crisp compared to other writers who meander around and have these subclauses. Those of you who know a little bit of German know how Germans love to have subclauses where the initial verb goes way to the end. And they really cut all of that out, which makes it more readable for children, of course, makes it more readable to read to children. Yes, so we do have comparisons. We have other fairy tales from the time period that really showcase how brilliant the Grimms are in their, and how elegant they are stylistically. We have fairy tales also from the late 18th century that are much more like French fairy tales. They are much more narrative, where the Grimms are much more a very elegant oral tale.
Is it almost like, you know what to expect? You don't have all the content, but this is how the story is going to go.
Right, and that's the that's the standardization that I was telling about. You know how the story begins, you know how the story ends, which of course make the story easy to remember. The standardization is an now I can't say the word, mnemonic device, right? A memory device, so that you can tell the story without having to rely on the written tale, right? So that allows us to tell the story, bedtime stories to children. Yeah.
So we got a lot of, positive feedback. Thank you. This was enjoyable, very fabulous. And, people are asking, when is the next trip? And
oh, yeah. So you tell me when the pandemic is over. We love to go. We had a wonderful time in Germany. As I said, we sampled so much German food. The first thing I did after I came back to the United States was go and eat Mexican food, just because we had so much Sauerbraten and sausage. It was a wonderful trip. We really got to see a lot of these original places where the Grimms had lived and worked, and what had inspired them. So Christoph, if we all wear our mask next fall, what do you think?
Let's assume we're all living in a fairy tale, because you said earlier that no matter how small you are, the outcome will be positive. No matter how powerless you are, it will turn into something positive. So that's my lesson we're taking off for tonight with this pandemic thing.
Right.
One question more. Can you recommend a good English translation of the Grimm fairy tales? I think this is a good question.
Yes. So there are a number of really good English translations. The fairy tales got translated in the 19th century into English, right? But we have a new edition. Unfortunately, my my books are in my university office, to which I have no access, right? But there is a great translation of the 1812 edition with the first, so it's the 1812 and the 1815 edition, those 86 and 70 tales put together. And you can really see what the first edition looked like before they got revised and sort of toned down. So that just came out in a new translation by Jack Sipes. And it's called the original fairy tales or something. Then Philip Pullman has a great edition of the fairy tales where that also references the first edition, where he has written creatively about the fairy tales. Otherwise, the standard or the regular translation that you find is based on the 1857 edition. So on the 7th edition, the basically what we call the edition out of the last hand before they died, that so the Grimms thought was the best edition, right?
So the amateur can kind of like Google for like first edition translation and would find something out. Yeah.
Right. And Jack Sipes is one of the fairy tale scholars, and he has put out that first edition. Jack Sipes, Z-I-P-E-S.
And of course,
wonderful scholar. He was my mentor at the University of Minnesota, and he has really written a lot about the fairy tales. If you want to read a little bit about the gore and about the sexual innuendo in fairy tales, you should check Marie Tartar, T-A-R, T-A-R-T-A-R, Tartar. She was a professor at Harvard University, and she has written a lot about the gore and the horror and the sexual violence in fairy tales, if you're interested in that.
Let's go to one or two more questions. A really cool one that I think, do the Germans enjoy the tale still, or is this more of an American interest?
No, the Germans love the tales. And there are lots and lots of films, fairy tale films. It's actually a very, very popular genre. And every holiday, there are fairy tale films and that are broadcasted. It was super popular in the GDR, right? And Christoph can maybe talk about that more. So the GDR, because fairy tales are not political in that obvious Cold War way, right? And so the GDR actually invested quite a bit of money in wonderful fairy tale films. And they are some of my favorite.
Some of them are, in the modern setting, where I do remember some of those movies where the giant and the witch and the little people, I dare to say what, the derogatory term these days, but the dwarf, they all show up in the modern world. And this was a Czech series done by the Czech Republic. And it was one of the things that I loved and consumed as a kid. So yes, the Germans do like their fairy tales still. And I'm sad to say I do raise a little child right now, and she doesn't really have much of connection to that. So maybe Kari can come over and tell some of those tales to her.
I could. Although my own children did not like fairy tales either. My sons thought they were way too scary. So
yeah, true. Let's see. A question by Donald. Did their work make them wealthy at the time? Speaking of the Grimm brothers, did they make any money out of this?
No, not really. So they actually always had a real paying day job. They became professors at the university in Göttingen, which is really, really close to Kassel, right? So if you remember the map, it's a little bit further north and a little bit further east. So they became professors there. When, after the Napoleonic Wars, when Germany reconstituted, it reconstituted again as this sort of fragmented not an empire, but the aristocracy was not willing to give up their powers. And so Germany never united as a nation. And the Grimm brothers and 5 other professors in Göttingen stood up for freedom of speech and condemned the prince of that area against censorship. And they were all summarily dismissed. They had to leave their posts, which was very, very difficult for Wilhelm, because Wilhelm had a wife and 3 children, right? And they were itinerant for a little while until they were offered professorships in Berlin. So the Grimms actually ended up in Berlin working for the Prussians, who did not like free speech either, but they had to take on jobs because they really did not have the means otherwise to support themselves. Also, let's not forget, the 19th century is not the century of copyright. So people, when they saw these books were so super popular, people would just print these copies of the book and sell them, and you couldn't go after them. It was very, very difficult, right? So authors lived off their advances. So a publisher looked at the book and thought, well, I can make, this much of money, and then they would give a certain amount of that money to the author. But the author wouldn't make money after the book became successful. And that's probably also one of the reasons why the Grimms revised their fairy tales over and over again, because every edition made them more money. But so I would say they were comfortable. They had comfortable bourgeois lives, enough so that they could stand up and say, in support of freedom of speech, but not enough that we could say that they are rich.
All right. I'm scrolling here on the side. We have like 7 more unopened questions. So let's see if we can get to some of them. Karin will also read the comments later on. There's a lot of compliments. So thank you.
Oh,
everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I love compliments. So keep them coming.
All right. But make sure you read them because they're really, really kind words. Let me get to one here. Michelle is asking, you stated that the Grimms removed violent content, but I was always taught that German stories often included let me see, I lost scroll here. I'll repeat from the beginning. You stated that the Grimms removed violent content, but it was always taught that German stories often included such content to teach children obedience, such as the stories in the Struwwelpeter. I often heard Grimm stories with violent content, such as Cinderella's sister cut their toes off to fit in the slippers, but the blood running out of the shoe gave them away. How was it decided what was cut and what was kept?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And here we would have to go into the editorial notes, right? So I think violence that was considered gratuitous. So think American horror movie, right? The violence is only there so that the makeup artist can shine, right? Gratuitous violence. So for the Grimms, cutting off the self-mutilation aspect of it was integral, was part of the story. Also, the pecking out of the eyes was part of the story, right? Where that violence was considered necessary and integral to the story. What is very interesting, later when Disney took over, he made the violence no longer emanate from somebody giving the order that the queen has to wear burning shoes and dance herself to death. The Disney then made the violence come from heaven. So it was a divine punishment, right? So I think what you consider violent and what the Grimms considered violent are 2 different things. So if you compare the 1812 edition to the 1857 edition, you will see how they tempered down the violence. But of course, for American sensibilities of the 21st century, they still look pretty violent. But as I said, the violence, what is important is that the violence is not gratuitous, but it's integral to the story. To talk about Struwwelpeter, which is also a really fun tale, Struwwelpeter is a much later product, is a product of Wilhelmine Germany. And that is a much more militaristic society, a much more harsh society. So this Struwwelpeter was written after the Grimms. So we can see how violence also changes what type of education we think is appropriate for children. So the Grimms would not have supported the Struwwelpeter, like cutting off people's hands and you know, like has some pretty awful violence in there. So the Grimms would not have supported that, actually. So as we can see, the world is not moving toward perfectibility. It goes in waves. And so there was a lot more violence in Wilhelmine Germany, of course, that then fed into the 20th century.
Yeah, we're talking Prussian rule.
Yeah, Prussian, right? And the Grimms were not Prussian, they were from Hesse.
All right. So are there explanations for why the original French fairy tales were more, no, did we already answer that? More sexual, more violent, sexual, and complex?
The French tales?
Yeah.
Well, the French tales are from the 16th and 17th century, so they were written for a different audience than the Grimms did, right? And actually, the French tales are not as violent as the first edition of the Grimm tales. So as the French tales migrated over to Germany and then got told and retold, they did get infused with some of the German sensibilities.
Fascinating. Can you recommend some books about and or editions of the Grimm's fairy tale? We talked a little bit about editions.
Yeah, so again, I would really, because most Americans know a translation of the 1857 edition. So I always tell people, go, and we have it at the library. I ordered it for the library when we can check out things again. Go and check out the 1812 edition and see how different those tales are from the way you know them. And especially if you only know the tales through Disney, those are going to be a revelation. So I think go and check that one out. Also, check out some of the illustrations that were done with the fairy tales, because that tells you a lot of the illustrators and their sensibilities. We have some really delightful illustrations in our rare books, which of course is also closed right now.
When the Marriott Library opens again, go to the rare books curator and ask him about these editions, and you can see some really cool books that we have here in Salt Lake City at the Marriott Library. The most visited building in all of Utah, by the way. Shout out to the library. Let's see, we're almost getting to the bottom here. So there were some comments about how beautiful Göttingen is and fairy tale-like. Someone, Brent points out, also I wanted to point out that the early royal families stem from the Hanover area, which we talked about, and that many tombs are available in Celle. Celle is a city near Hanover. Do you have a favorite fairy tale story and why?
So yes, I have, my favorite story is Alleyrauch, and it's a story of a daughter, a king's daughter. The mother dies and the father wants to commit incest because he loved his wife so much, and the daughter looks so much like her mother. And it's how brilliantly and how smart the girl is to evade this incest. And she leaves her home, and she hides in different furs. That's why she is called all furs in English. You know, she hides in different disguises until she meets the right person and reveals to be the right princess. But I just love that story because, I mean, it's brutal on the one hand and talks about a real issue for women, especially in the 19th century, right? Sexual harassment, sexual attacks, and talks about just how ingenious this young woman is in protecting herself and getting to the happy end. And we have, of course, an optimistic happy end where she ends up happily ever after, and all furs. So it's not one that Americans know very much, but go and check it out.
All right, cool. That, I think, will conclude it. Like I said, lots of compliments, Karin. Thank you so much. A wonderful lecture. For those out there with students or soon-to-be students coming to the U, you teach at the College of Humanities. One of them is From Grimm's to Disney.
From Grimm to Disney, and we go a little bit further. We go to the Grimm, to Disney, and we look at scripted drama, and of course, we look at modern Disney movies and how they make use of the Grimm fairy tales.
And I hope we all who joined us today realize how important the humanities and stories, and yes, how important this is, especially in a pandemic. I really hope that students in the future, once we get out of this, return to the U in person, get their whole experience again, but also have a different look at the humanities. And I hope that anyone out here who's traveling in the future will travel with a new set of eyes and different appreciation, hopefully elevated, and never take things for granted again. So Karin, thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And I hope you go through this healthy, and everyone out there too, stay healthy, be good. And any last word to our viewership?
Well, thank you for allowing me to speak to you all. It was such a treat. As I said, I'm feeling kind of lonely. I miss my students. I miss my classroom. So this is really a wonderful opportunity for me. And go and read the 1812 fairy tales. We have a lot of time at our hands now. So why not?
Great. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.